Hi everyone, welcome to the GoldFish Report and welcome back to another edition of Bullet Points, which is a special presentation that focuses on a certain area of policy, public policy that the president that's in the news or that the president is involved with directly. This Bullet Points presentation is titled The President, the Press, and the First Amendment. And we're going to, as our viewers become used to this platform, the bullet points are presented the first, I would say 20 minutes or so. The first half is going to be presented on YouTube and BitChute. And then the rest of the program is going to be featured over on Vimeo, on our Vimeo on demand page for a very small fee because it supports the channel. So because I don't like commercials myself, and with the censorship on YouTube, it doesn't really even pay to monetize the channel, but we never have monetized the channel. But we do have to support the channel. So this has to do with, this is a very in-depth review, policy review. It's not a dissertation, but I can tell you that it's very in-depth in terms of these issues. I'm going to screen share the, excuse me, the springtime. Happy spring, everyone. But the springtime has definitely brought allergies, so I definitely have an issue with my voice these days. So I'm going to screen share this and do the slideshow right from the beginning. So let's see, I hope this is plugged in. Yeah. Okay, so let's go right into the table of contents. So the issues that are going to be covered in this report pertain to the president and the First Amendment, and the president and the press. So you can see those first two. We're going to look at different aspects of that. We're going to look at a few examples of this interaction with the president and the press, or that relationship, I should say. And also, we're going to take a very close-up look at the First Amendment. It's very interesting. We're going to focus on a congressional publication that was that I have taken excerpts from. It is a Congressional Research Service, and they did do a really good report on freedom of the speech in the press and exceptions to the First Amendment. So I will take excerpts from that in my slides. We're also going to, and of course this also has to do with the limitations of the First Amendment, which, folks, you'd be very surprised to know that there are many limitations to the First Amendment. But they do seem, sorry about that, they do seem to be, I think, in thought out with prudence. I don't think it's just arbitrary, and we'll talk about that as we get to it. We're also going to talk about the Smith-Mundt Act, which we've talked about on GoldFish Reports before. We're going to talk about Operation Mockingbird and also false flag propaganda, because all of this has to do with the First Amendment, one way or the other. So we will get started. So what we have is, we know that President Trump has been supporting First Amendment rights. He recently signed an executive order to improve transparency and promoting free speech in higher education. So in other words, if you're a university receiving federal funding, you will be at risk of losing that funding if you're not supporting the First Amendment on campus. And the president made a very good point. His point was, you can't be teaching this in theory and not practicing it. So makes a lot of sense to me. So here we reject oppressive speech codes, censorship, political correctness, and every other attempt by the hard left to stop people from challenging ridiculous and dangerous ideas. These ideas are dangerous. Instead, we believe in free speech, including online and including on campus. So we all know about the massive media censorship that's going on. We know GoldFish Report has been hit very hard. We've been targeted very hard in terms of censorship on YouTube, on excuse me, on Twitter, on Facebook, and it's been very difficult, trying to do what we normally do. Here we also have the president saying, promoting First Amendment rights. President Donald J. Trump is committed to promoting free speech on college campuses. I'd like to see free speech everywhere, not just on college campuses, but this is a really good first step, because this really does, actually it's very personal to me because of graduate school issues that came up. And as soon as I started reporting on the president, doing POTUS reports, funny how the university had blocked me from re-registering in my graduate public policy program. And that will be coming to light, sooner or later. They're very liberal, so anyone who's very conservative, they're going to try to censor. So this is, what they're doing. Okay, as you can see, I'm gonna have to go use it this way. Sorry about that. Here. So what we see is, okay, aside from it being available on the GoldFish Report, the GoldFish Report publishes all the president's news releases, press releases, and press events. We have it also published in the Federal Register, as we have discussed previously, as I have reported previously, that this is where you will go to find the executive orders from the president, and here is where this one appears. So yes, this is official. It's very good news. So I wanted to remind our folks of that. Also, as far back, look, this is how our country was founded, right? Our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost. Thomas Jefferson. So this is important. It's important to have, for the president in particular, to make these statements about the First Amendment. It's important for the president to take the action that he took in terms of doing the executive order itself, and of course, when it came to another issue. So we have here this issue. The White House suspends press pass of CNN's Jim Acosta after his testy exchange with Trump. And our viewers may recall I was present at that press release. I was live streaming that event also on Facebook and on YouTube. And it was a very contentious, I'll tell you personally, I felt embarrassed for the president. I felt he was really it was harassment. It was harassment. I felt it personally myself. Not that it wasn't directed at me. I felt it for the president, like in an empathic, like a compassionate way. It was very frustrating. So what is this all about? Here we have, Jim Acosta. So Sarah Sanders, first the press secretary, publishes, President Trump believes in a free press and expects and welcomes tough questions of him and his administration. We will, however, never tolerate a reporter placing his hands on a young woman just trying to do her job as a White House intern. And here Jim Acosta is saying this is a lie, but here's the video showing this. So, here Jim Acosta stepped out of his role as a reporter and went into being an advocate and accused the president of this not being an invasion. That's not really for him to determine. So he's just supposed to report the facts. But this was a big deal, because what happened was they challenged this in the court. CNN Jim Acosta had no good First Amendment case against Trump. Now this is interesting. Jim Acosta and CNN had no good First Amendment case. Here you have someone on Twitter posting a victory for the First Amendment and a free and independent press. Judge hands CNN a victory in its bid to restore Jim Acosta's press privileges. However, here I love Governor Huckabee and Sarah Sanders Huckabee, and he appropriately tweeted, "What would federal judge do if Acosta challenged him in his courtroom and argued and wouldn't shut up when the judge told him to, and refused to give up a mic when bailiff tried to retrieve it?" Well, he'd probably go to jail. He makes a very good point. He says, asking for a friend, I love him. And for half of America, you just got to love him. You got to love him. You don't have to agree with everything he does, but boy, you got to love his heart and soul and his daughters. And this is the issue, okay? So CNN, Jim Acosta's revocation of the White House press pass. First thing is the U.S. District Judge Timothy Kelly, who was appointed to the bench by President Trump, no less, okay? So that's not partisan, okay? Granted CNN's request to restore Acosta's hard press pass. He said, I want to emphasize the very limited nature of this ruling. This is limited. But why would he say that? This is First Amendment, right? This should be cut and dry, but it's not. Here he says, while Kelly and Acosta's Fifth Amendment rights to due process were violated, he did not issue a ruling on whether the reporter's First Amendment rights were violated. So this is important because, look, folks, our due process is as important as any other constitutional privilege that we have. Today, he also further commented, today the court made clear that there is no absolute First Amendment right to access the White House. So I am very, very grateful that GoldFish Report got to go to the White House because we understand that, and it's a privilege for us, and we hope to go there again. That according to Sarah Sanders, and said in response to the court, we will temporarily reinstate the reporter's hard pass. We will also further develop rules and processes to ensure fair and orderly press conference in the future. Now that's significant because that there refers to due process. There was this unspoken rule, and I was reporting from the White House prior to that day, just a few days really, but it was enough to know that there was just unspoken code of conduct, unspoken, code of conduct basically. But this is a more of an official code of conduct that they are trying to establish and make it clear and so that everyone has the right to due process when it comes to things like this. But again, this wasn't like CNN was being banned from the White House. They had, as the president even mentioned, probably the most number of hard passes issued to a network was CNN. And it was probably, 50, 60. I don't know. It's probably a very large number. So certainly it did not, prevent CNN from reporting the news. It did not violate their constitutional right to free press, because merely if one person in that organization is, behaving in a questionable or even perhaps harassing manner, they had so many other people to send in to get the story and get the news. So it's not like they lost anything and there was no irreparable harm. So we'll see where that ends up going. So basically but there's always been this really contentious relationship between the presidents who are really trying to, restore good values and, I would say, trying to do things that were really good for the country, but obviously seemed to confront a lot of opposition. So what we have here is some selected quotes from JFK and the press. You know that there's a very famous, and we're going to refer to this again in this presentation before it's over. But there's a very contentious relationship also back from the time of JFK. So here's some remarks. He says, I have selected as a title of my remarks tonight, The President and the Press. This was from his 1961 speech at the Waldorf Astoria, where he was addressing the Newspapers Publishers Association. Okay, and his speech was called The President and the Press. So some may suggest that this would be more naturally worded, the president versus the press, but those are not my sentiments tonight. Of course, I would rather have his voice on this, speaking these words, but we're just going to try to get through this a little bit quickly. It is true, however, that when a well-known diplomat from another country demanded recently that our State Department repudiate certain newspaper attacks on his colleague, it was unnecessary for us to reply that this administration was not responsible for the press, for the press had already made it clear that it was not responsible for this administration. That is such a Kennedy quote, it's just amazing, but it's very true. Nevertheless, my purpose here tonight is not to deliver the usual assault on the so-called one-party press. And how interesting that it had flipped from, being viewed as more of the conservative military-industrial complex side to how it has flipped to, it was basically when he was assassinated, in my opinion, and from the research of many that this was the beginning of the coup d'etat of our country. And this is why President Trump is here to finally stop that and put an end to that. Now, some people who are listening to this may take issue with that you may have a different opinion, in which that's fine, but that's the opinion that we're holding here on the GoldFish Report. So we'll continue. But in terms of these guaranteed constitutional protections, you would think it would be a slam dunk. And I love, that people are so emphatic about having, the ability to say, yeah, this is my free speech, I'm protected. But quite honestly, just, a little wake up call is that it's not free to defend it. I mean, you need to really spend a lot of money. And of course, I'm currently in, just for disclosure purposes, I'm currently in a First Amendment battle right now in the legal system. And it is a bankrupt sue. So, but you know what? Anyone's First Amendment battle is everyone's First Amendment battle, because any infringement, any deprivation of our constitutional rights, as you will see, is it's very significant. It says here that constitutional protection refers to those basic protections guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. For example, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, equal protection from the Bill of Rights, and the fundamental protection of the First Amendment relating to speech, press, religion, and of course, right to assemble, are all examples of certain protections guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. It's really not black and white. And really, that's why I felt it was so important to put this bullet points presentation together, because it's not so black and white, as we will see. First Amendment of the United States Constitution. So the First Amendment provides that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. We've heard this from time immemorial, right? This language restricts the government's ability to constrain the speech of citizens. The prohibition on abridgment of the freedom of speech is not absolute. Certain types of speech may be prohibited outright. Some types of speech may be more easily constrained than others. And we're going to go into this. This is real important. Furthermore, speech may be more easily regulated depending on the location at which it takes place. And this is really important, folks, because, this is education. This is why we're offering this to on Vimeo for a small fee. It's like, what, $6 or something. But, look, it's a tremendous amount of work put into doing this research and providing this education, because you'd rather know this now and in advance than when you find yourself in a situation. Because I can recall when during the what was it, the Standing Rock, that whole protest about the water protectors blocking the pipeline. Okay, they didn't want the pipeline in their neighborhoods, in their communities, and on their property, on their tribal lands. So this was a very big issue. And I can recall, because I knew I had people on the ground there who would report what was happening. And they would have free speech zones. They would really basically cordon off an area that was, look, you're in the middle of the flat plains of North Dakota, and you have to have a cordoned area to have free speech. That's crazy. That's crazy. But sometimes they do this. So, but you're going to see that's not a good example. That was not a really good example of why some constraints might really be necessary. That was I would say really too far reaching, to the point of perhaps an abuse of power, abuse of process. It's possible. I'm just saying. I'm not making a final call on that, but it sounds like that's what happened. And this is the congressional research that I'm going to be citing. This was a really important document that was compiled, and I think you're all going to find this very thorough, and this is who it was compiled by. And this is very interesting. So this talks about the limitations to the First Amendment. Okay. And I think at this point, we have kind of gone to, I'm going to start here, and we're probably going to close up at this point after this slide, because what we're going to do is finish this over on Vimeo. So we're going to go into this for a couple of minutes and then probably close up. So the limitations to the First Amendment. So for example, the court has decided that the First Amendment provides no protection for obscenity, for child pornography, or for speech that constitutes what has become widely known as fighting words. The court has also decided that the First Amendment provides less than full protection to commercial speech, defamation, libel, and slander, speech that may be harmful to children, speech broadcast on radio and television, as opposed to speech transmitted via cable or the internet as public employee speech. Okay, so we know this because we know that people can be sued for libel, right? We know that people can be sued for slander. So that's not protected then by the Constitution. And for people, for speech that may be harmful for children, well, we know that there's limitations and restrictions put on, let's say, you know, adult magazines that are sold in regular stores and so forth. There's age limits. So there are restrictions to who can have even access to some of that speech. So, and it's for the interest and protection of the children. We also know that speech broadcast, radio and television, we know that until cable television came along, you couldn't say, there were so many things you couldn't do, so many words you couldn't say. Because it was family, you know, oriented. So they kept it in a certain genre. Okay. Once cable television came in, and of course now the internet, you really have, you know, a wide range of freedom, more freedom. But still, there's some limitation, because as we're finding today, we're finding that Facebook and YouTube and all these other social media giants, you know, they're imposing their own. And I have to say, and I'm not saying that they're justified. I think they're not justified. I think if they're doing, if they're taking, you know, if they're banning, like, you know, racism, if they're banning violence against people, it's really shocking when those things come into your news feed, when people, you know, use profanity, when people are using, you know, like a hate, like in a hateful sense against a particular race or religion. That's, you know, look, I don't need to see that, you know. I don't need to know your hate. I don't want to know your hate. I don't want to know about it. I don't care about what you hate. You know what I mean? Like, I don't care. And I don't think many people do either, although there's some who don't have anything else to do and just looking to see who's hating who and who they can hate. I don't know. I don't know why people do what they do all the time. Sometimes they just go with the flow. But of course, you know, anything that incites violence or anything that shows extreme violence, you know, I can see the limitations for that as well. But there should be a place to go if somebody, you know, deems that they want to expose themselves to that. I don't think it should be outright banned. If someone wants to see, um, you know, like for instance, there was a report about the riots that are happening in France. They were pretty graphic, but they weren't pictures of violence per se. This particular image I'm talking about, but it was graphic in that you could the stitches and the bruising. I mean, it was obviously a very wounded person, and that's shocking. But that's part of the story that needs to be told. The question is it too graphic for children? And the answer is probably that it is, that yes, it probably is. So would it be better to have restrictions on that kind of content? And I would say that's reasonable. You know, so one way to deal with that is that on Facebook they have what you can put like a virtual, you know, cover over it, so that, you know, if you want to view it, you have the option to click on that and view it. And I think that's good. So I'm giving Facebook credit for that. I think that's a really good option, because it's like, okay, there's a story here. It came into my timeline, came into my newsfeed rather, and it's talking about, I can see from the description what it's talking about, and I have the choice whether I want to view that, you know, graphic image. And, you know, folks, that's really reasonable. And I love that we can do that with the digital, um, milieu that we have. With print, you can't do that unless, you know, it's very cost prohibitive to do things like that in print. And obviously you don't have that option. You can bleep things out, you know, in terms of audio on radio, but there's no visual, there's no graphic, you know. That's the only way to deal with it, is you can kind of like bleep it out or delete it or whatever. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And so we are talking about here limitations on the First Amendment protection. And, you know, there really are quite a few, and we're going to go into that because I think it's really important people really do understand this before you go and claim, you know, your First Amendment right to just do and say anything anywhere, because you really don't have that kind of First Amendment protection. And I think some reasons for this are very reasonable. So here we're talking about the First Amendment protection may be subject to regulation of time, place, and manner of expression, which are content neutral, are narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest, and leave open ample alternative channels of communication. So this is good. So this is saying that, okay, well, we're going to say, you know, well, we don't want, we don't want somebody preaching religion on the front steps of the post office because it's government property and you're obstructing the walkway of people trying to get in and out and doing their official government business. So, you know, that might seem reasonable, but it's from the looks of this. This is, this is like if they're on the sidewalk or something like that, that's one of the examples. Also, the First Amendment protection may be restricted on the basis of its content if the restriction passes strict scrutiny. Well, now we're starting to sound like this is starting to turn very gray now. It's not like this black and white, oh, I have the right to say anything, anywhere, anytime. You really don't. And this is exactly what this is talking about. So if the government shows that a restriction serves to promote a compelling interest and is the least restrictive means to further the articulated interest. So what does all this mean? And it means a lot. There's a lot going on here. And what I'm going to do is we're going to unfold all of this, and we're going to go into the details about this. And we're going to also go into how this, how the Smith-Mundt Act played a role in redefining First Amendment, how Operation Mockingbird did the same thing, redefined First Amendment in some ways, how QAnon, we also have some information to contribute from Q. We also have, information about false flags, how all of this, got, how it's been permitted, how freedom of speech has permitted things that maybe weren't so welcomed to our society as well. And we're going to take a look at that. So I want to thank everyone for joining me for this first part. And we are going to go over onto Vimeo, and I'm going to continue this presentation. If you're interested in knowing more about the First Amendment and a little bit more about the history, and also, the consequences of what some of the impacts of the First Amendment, how far-reaching, and maybe even the manipulation of the First Amendment by people who weren't exactly looking out for America. So we have a lot of that in the news today. I would go as far as saying they're the same characters, and we're going to explore that further on Vimeo. So I do want to thank our viewers for viewing, being with us, joining us. And I do hope that you join us over on Vimeo for part 2. And if not, if this is where we part ways, then I want to thank you for viewing. We'll be back tomorrow with a POTUS report with Jim Fetzer, as usual. And you can always find that on BitChute, and also we do retweet that as well. And it's always, the YouTube links are always found on our website at thegoldfishreport.com under POTUS report, page 3. Because it's like we're on our 3rd page of posting those. But it is the only way to keep Jim Fetzer on the internet. And there's going to be interesting news and developments tomorrow. Folks, you don't want to miss this, so stand by, and I hope you enjoy our reporting, and we'll continue to bring it to you. So thanks for viewing. This concludes this part of part 1 of our Bullet Points First Amendment presentation. Thanks for viewing.